Make room for Javi.
This is day 58 of 365, and today's project is ceiling insulation 11 of 44. Today I'd like to share another story of a dear friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, John Hall. The first time I met John was the 22nd annual Hamfest. It was an amateur radio show that I was introduced to by a high school buddy of mine you know as Electrical Engineer John. For privacy's sake, I avoid last names unless they've passed away. John introduced me to a friend Carl, who then introduced me to John Hall. John Hall and I went to the same church, and years later, when I joined the choir, I got to know him on a more personal level. It's a small world. The choir was like a family, and I felt John was quite like an older brother. Until I met him, I didn't truly understand what the words kindred spirit meant. John and I shared a love of music, computers, electronics, ham radio, our faith, and mostly woodworking, but the list went on. He would often be the chef or the logistics person on many a choir trip. Let me tell you about one of those choir trips. A choir named Melodic Prayer volunteered and sang contemporary Christian music Saturdays and Sundays at 3 different masses at our church. Throughout those years, the church would pay for our lodgings and our food for our annual retreat. Now, mind you, if you've ever been to a choir like this one, think of a young adult group that sings together. We would practice on Thursdays and sing on Saturdays and Sundays. The choir was anywhere between 20 and 40 members strong. And then there were the, how shall we say, choir groupies, as we called them. The close friends who couldn't or wouldn't sing, but still contributed to the gang in many ways. This so-called retreat for everyone involved a lodge or camping in Central Florida. There was but one evening reserved for spiritual singing. The rest of the time was just a bunch of young adults having a blast. Volleyball, swimming, or tubing in a river, bonfires each night, horseback riding. It was a 4-day vacation with an evening of reflection. I think the church may have been under a false impression that it was 4 days of reflection. Either way, the outcome was the same. Now, John would be in charge of the food as well as much of the cooking. And when John purchased food, let's just say that after our trips, we all had leftovers for a couple days and still had uncooked food for each of us for a week. I can't tell you how many times the musical directors would try to rein in his Costco run for the week. In addition to the choir, John and I often volunteered at numerous Emmaus Men's weekend retreats. And we both got a thrill from being needed and appreciated, as well as giving back to the community. When I leased my storefront in the early 2000s and opened my engraving and sign business, John would often drop by. I'd show him all the machines like the laser engraver, the 60-inch color vinyl printer, and various tools of the trade. One day, I had a job for the state park in Key West. They needed a bunch of signs for their various plants. Well, they gave me the specifications as well as the text. While I had a professional laser engraver and a professional vinyl cutter, I decided that King Core board was a better substrate for these signs. However, these signs needed a precise tool like a specialized CNC. I spoke with John and I told him I was going to Sears to try out the new Craftsman Carve-Right CNC. Long story short, I tried it for 3 days and it was bust. It didn't engrave crisply enough on the material it needed to, and I promptly returned the $3,000 unit for a refund, ended up buying a more expensive precision engraver for 4 times the price. I think back often dearly of John. John Hall passed away in April 2011, his wife Mirta shortly thereafter. As they didn't have any children themselves, his niece Annie and her husband inherited the house. They called me up a couple years later to ask if I wanted any of John's old tools to add to mine, as they were trying to clear out the shed to act as Annie's craft room. Now, John was an extremely successful pack rat, so I gladly volunteered to clear out anything they didn't want, dump the garbage, and clear out the shed. I told them I'd also volunteer to remodel the shed for them, drywall, insulation, paint, electrical, into a craft room. I'd do all the labor for them. They gladly accepted, and I was happy to give something back to the family. Likewise, I was happy to have the occasional opportunity to create stuff with some of John's old tools. In most cases, a Dear John letter is addressed by the person leaving. My Dear John letter is addressed to a dear friend that is gone. John, you are still deeply missed, as I have said this to a very few others. May you forever rest in peace, knowing you will always be remembered by those whose lives you have touched. Okay, folks, that's it for today. We'll continue tomorrow.
Make room for Javi.